Part 1: A War Beneath the Waves. In early 1915, far from the thunder of artillery on the Western Front, a quieter, darker war was beginning beneath the cold waters of the Atlantic. It was a war without warning, without flags, and without mercy. Passenger liners, cargo ships, and fishing vessels, all could vanish in seconds. No declaration. No chance to surrender. No time to escape. This decision, made in Berlin and executed by steel submarines known as U-boats, would not only redefine naval warfare, it would eventually pull a distant and reluctant power into the greatest conflict the world had ever known. That power was the United States of America. This is the story of how Germany's decision to wage unrestricted submarine warfare in 1915 became one of the key factors that drew the United States into World War I, and how a hidden war beneath the sea reshaped the 20th century forever. The naval balance of power in 1914. When World War I erupted in August 1914, the balance of naval power heavily favored Great Britain. The Royal Navy was the largest and most powerful fleet on Earth. Its battleships ruled the oceans, its cruisers protected global trade routes, and its control of the seas allowed Britain to impose a devastating naval blockade on Germany. This blockade was legal under international law, or at least, Britain claimed it was. By cutting off food, raw materials, and fuel, the British sought to starve the German economy into submission. By late 1914, the effects were already being felt. Food shortages, rising prices, civilian hardship, industrial strain. Germany knew it could not challenge the Royal Navy in a decisive surface battle. The risk was too great. The memory of Trafalgar still haunted German strategists. But Germany possessed something new. Something untested. Something terrifying. The Unterseeboot. The U-boat, Germany's secret weapon. At the start of the war, submarines were still considered experimental weapons. Most naval officers viewed them as unreliable, dishonorable, and unsuited for gentlemanly warfare. Germany disagreed. U-boats were small, stealthy, and deadly. They could slip past British patrols, avoid battleships entirely, and strike at the very heart of Britain's lifeline, its merchant shipping. Britain was an island nation. It imported over half of its food. Its factories depended on overseas materials. Without shipping, Britain would slowly choke. German naval planners saw an opportunity. If U-boats could sink enough merchant vessels, Britain might be forced to sue for peace, without Germany ever fighting the Royal Navy head-on. But there was a problem. The rules of war at sea. International naval law required merchant ships to be treated according to prize rules. Under these rules, a warship had to stop and search a merchant vessel, ensure the safety of the crew and passengers. Only then could the ship be sunk. For submarines, this was nearly impossible. To stop and search a ship, a U-boat had to surface, making it vulnerable to ramming, gunfire, or capture. Worse still, Britain began arming merchant ships and disguising warships as civilian vessels, known as Q-ships. To German commanders, this turned the rules of war into a death sentence. The solution seemed brutal, but logical. February 1915, a radical declaration. On February 4, 1915, Germany announced a dramatic escalation. The waters around the British Isles were declared a war zone. From that point forward, all enemy merchant ships would be sunk. Neutral ships were warned they sailed at their own risk. No guarantee of warning or rescue would be given. This marked the beginning of unrestricted submarine warfare. It was a gamble of enormous proportions. German leaders believed Britain would collapse before neutral nations, especially the United States, would intervene. They were wrong. America watches from across the Atlantic. At the time, the United States was officially neutral. President Woodrow Wilson was determined to keep America out of the European war. The nation was deeply divided. Many Americans sympathized with Britain and France. Others supported Germany. Millions simply wanted nothing to do with the conflict. But American ships traded with Britain. American citizens traveled on Atlantic liners. and American industry was becoming increasingly tied to the Allied war effort. Germany's declaration alarmed Washington. Wilson warned that the U.S. would hold Germany to strict accountability for any loss of American lives or property. Berlin listened, but did not stop. The submarines were already at sea. The first ships go down. In the weeks that followed, U-boats began sinking merchant vessels at an alarming rate. Ships disappeared in explosions and clouds of steam. Crews were left struggling in freezing waters. Survivors told horrifying stories of sudden attacks without warning. Some ships carried food, others coal, others passengers. The line between civilian and military targets blurred. Each sinking sent shockwaves through neutral nations, but one disaster would eclipse them all. A ship that changed history. In May 1915, a British passenger liner prepared to cross the Atlantic. She was fast, luxurious, famous. Her name was RMS Lusitania. What happened to her would forever change the course of the war, and America's relationship with Germany. Part 2: The Lusitania Shock. The Queen of the Atlantic. On May 1, 1915, the RMS Lusitania departed from New York bound for Liverpool. She was one of the fastest and most luxurious ocean liners in the world, a symbol of British maritime pride. Newspapers praised her speed, elegance, and safety. Many believed she was simply too fast to be caught by a submarine. Nearly 2,000 people were aboard. Wealthy passengers, families, artists, businessmen, 128 American citizens. Yet as the Lusitania prepared to sail, a chilling warning appeared in U.S. newspapers. The German embassy placed a formal notice stating that ships flying the British flag were liable to destruction in the war zone around the British Isles. Most passengers ignored it. The ships sailed anyway. A submarine in waiting. Off the coast of Ireland, German U-20, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger, patrolled the waters. Schwieger had already sunk several ships. His torpedoes were limited. His orders were clear. When he spotted the massive silhouette of the Lusitania on May 7, 1915, he knew instantly what he was seeing. At 2:10 p.m., Schwieger fired a single torpedo. It struck the liner on her starboard side. Seconds later, a second, far more powerful explosion tore through the ship, likely caused by coal dust or hidden munitions in the cargo hold. The Lusitania began to sink. 18 minutes of hell. Chaos erupted. Lifeboats were smashed or capsized. Passengers were thrown into icy waters. Children were torn from their parents' arms. Within 18 minutes, the Lusitania disappeared beneath the waves. 1,198 people died. Among them were 128 Americans. The Atlantic swallowed not just the ship, but any illusion that civilians were safe at sea. World reaction, outrage and horror. News of the sinking spread like wildfire. In Britain, it was portrayed as an act of barbarism. In neutral countries, it was seen as a warning. In the United States, it caused public outrage on a scale never seen before. American newspapers printed images of drowning mothers and children. Headlines screamed of murder on the high seas. President Woodrow Wilson faced enormous pressure to act. Yet Wilson hesitated. Wilson's dilemma. The United States was not ready for war. The army was small. The public was divided. Many Americans still believed neutrality was the moral high ground. Wilson chose diplomacy. In a series of stern diplomatic notes, the U.S. demanded an end to attacks on passenger ships, respect for neutral rights, accountability for American deaths. Germany defended its actions, claiming the Lusitania was secretly carrying war materials, which was, in fact, true. But this argument failed to calm American anger. Germany now faced a dangerous choice: continue unrestricted submarine warfare, or risk bringing the United States into the war. For the moment, Berlin backed down. The temporary retreat. By late 1915, Germany issued new orders. Passenger liners were not to be sunk without warning. Rescue of survivors was encouraged. U-boat operations were restricted. The policy of unrestricted submarine warfare was temporarily suspended. In Washington, this was seen as a victory for diplomacy. But beneath the surface, the German Navy believed the pause was a fatal mistake. A war paused, not ended. German admirals argued that submarines were the only weapon capable of defeating Britain. They warned. The blockade was strangling Germany. Civilian morale was collapsing. Time favored the Allies. The submarine campaign, they insisted, had to resume, no matter the consequences. For now, the Atlantic grew quieter. But the silence would not last. Part 3. The gamble repeated. The war turns against Germany. By 1916, the war on land had turned into a nightmare of attrition. Verdun. The Somme. Hundreds of thousands dead, for a few miles of mud. Germany's economy was buckling under the British blockade. Food shortages worsened. Malnutrition spread among civilians. Industrial output declined. The hope of a quick victory was gone. Inside the German High Command, a belief hardened: Britain could only be defeated at sea. The Sussex Incident. On March 24, 1916, a French passenger ferry, the SS Sussex, was struck by a German torpedo in the English Channel. Though the ship did not sink, dozens of passengers were killed or injured, including several Americans. In Washington, outrage flared once more. President Wilson issued an ultimatum. Either Germany abandoned attacks on passenger ships, or the United States would sever diplomatic relations. This was no longer a warning. It was a final line. The Sussex Pledge. In May 1916, Germany gave in. The Sussex Pledge promised that passenger ships would not be attacked. Merchant vessels would not be sunk without warning. Crews and passengers would be given a chance to escape. For Wilson, this was proof that American pressure worked. For German admirals, it was surrender. A dangerous debate in Berlin. As 1916 dragged on, Germany's leadership split into two camps. The civilian government feared American entry into the war. The Naval High Command believed the U.S. could be defeated or ignored. Admirals calculated that Britain would collapse within 5 months of unrestricted submarine warfare. Even if America declared war, it would be too late to matter. It was a cold, mathematical gamble, measured in sunk tonnage, not human lives. January 1917, the final decision. On January 9, 1917, Kaiser Wilhelm II approved the plan. Beginning February 1, 1917, Germany would resume unrestricted submarine warfare. All ships, enemy or neutral, would be sunk in the war zone. The dice were cast. American ships under attack. Within weeks, American merchant vessels were being destroyed. No warnings. No apologies. No survivors. Public opinion in the United States shifted dramatically. Neutrality no longer seemed honorable, it seemed naive. The Zimmermann telegram. Then came the final blow. British intelligence intercepted a secret message from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann. The telegram proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico, promising U.S. territory in return for joining the war against America. When the message was made public in March 1917, it electrified the nation. For many Americans, the threat was no longer distant. It was at their doorstep. The end of neutrality. German submarines had made the Atlantic a battlefield. And now, the United States could no longer stand aside. Part 4. The Price of the Deep. April 1917, America decides. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson stood before the United States Congress. His words were calm, but final. He spoke of American ships sunk without warning. American lives lost at sea. A world made unsafe by lawless warfare. Germany's submarine campaign, Wilson declared, was warfare against mankind. 4 days later, on April 6, 1917, the United States formally declared war on Germany. The gamble Germany had taken beneath the waves had failed. The irony of the U-boat campaign. At first, unrestricted submarine warfare seemed devastatingly effective. In early 1917, hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping were sunk each month. Britain stood closer to starvation than at any point in the war. But the campaign carried the seeds of its own defeat. The entry of the United States transformed the conflict. American industry surged. Fresh troops began crossing the Atlantic. Financial and material support flowed to the Allies. Germany had struck Britain, but awakened a giant. The Allied response? To counter the U-boat threat, the Allies adopted a long-resisted solution, the convoy system. Merchant ships now sailed in groups, protected by destroyers. Depth charges. Aircraft. Losses plummeted. By late 1917, the submarine menace was being contained. A war won above the waves. In 1918, American soldiers arrived in France in overwhelming numbers. The German spring offensive failed. The Allies counterattacked. Germany, exhausted and starving, began to collapse. On November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent. The war that began in trenches ended with diplomacy, but its turning point had come from the sea. Final analysis: a fatal misjudgment. Germany's decision to launch unrestricted submarine warfare in 1915 and resume it in 1917 was born of desperation. It was militarily logical, strategically risky, politically disastrous. The policy violated long-standing rules of war, blurred the line between combatant and civilian, and ultimately united American public opinion against Germany. What was intended as a weapon to defeat Britain became the very reason Germany lost the war. Conclusion: the lesson of the deep. Unrestricted submarine warfare changed naval combat forever. It proved that technology could overturn centuries of tradition. Civilians were no longer safe in modern war. Decisions made in secrecy could reshape global history. From the cold depths of the Atlantic came a choice that altered the fate of nations. A silent war beneath the waves drew the United States into World War I and helped decide the outcome of the conflict. Sometimes, history is not shaped by the loudest battles, but by the unseen ones.